Dear friends, welcome. And this is the Religion Seminar at Western Sydney University, bringing you the latest in research in religious studies. I'm Milad Milani, and I'm coming to you from Darug Land. My guest speaker today is Stephen Drakeley, now retired, but a former colleague of mine at Western Sydney University, whose teaching and research focused on history, some religion, and political thought in Indonesia. Today, he'll be talking to us about something else entirely. 1970s hippie communes, post-World War II radical Christian precursors. Stephen, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for making the time. I welcome you to present to us your talk.
Yeah, so this is kind of sort of a retirement project research that I'm doing because if I didn't do it, nobody else would. It's not really my subject area, so I've had to sort of educate myself about Australian history and heritage history. I'm researching the history of Glenfield Farm, and I'm doing it with my former colleague and former student, Dr. Rowan Day, whom some of you may remember. Um, and Rowan is now a heritage historian. So he brings that expertise. And I want to acknowledge right up that quite a lot of the research that I'm basing this little presentation on is actually conducted by him. We're co-authoring a book that we hope to have out in a year or two. So Glenfield Farm is one of Australia's oldest collection of buildings. It was built between 1810 and 1820 at Casula, just on the outskirts of Liverpool. It's a place of enormous heritage value because all four of the original buildings, that is a homestead, a dairy cottage, a barn or a coach house, and a privy, are still intact. So it's a great, as well as being one of the oldest buildings in Australia, it's also a great example of a farm, how a farm would have been constructed in those days. So in particular, what we're researching is a commune or a Glenfield Farm Goodwill Cooperative Limited, which was founded in 1972. And this cooperative owned Glenfield Farm until 2001. It was then acquired by the Department of Urban Planning and Environment, who handed it to a restoration to Historical Houses Trust, which now has a different name, but anyway. So the Historic Houses Trust spent a lot of public money restoring these buildings to their 19th century condition, and they've done a beautiful job. So the community that resided at Glenfield Farm until 1994 was routinely labelled a hippie commune. And to some extent, that's true. Certainly in the late 60s, early 70s period, you could more justifiably say that. Probably few of the people who lived there would have used that terminology. They would have seen themselves as protagonists or proponents, I should say, of alternative society movement and progressive in a whole lot of things, but certainly an overlap with what typically conventionally regarded as hippies. And full disclosure, I was one of those hippies. I lived at the farm for about a year, pretty much straight after I left school. From 1975 to 1976, I was pretty much living on the commune. In its heyday, during the early 1970s, Glenfield Farm, or mid 1970s, Glenfield Farm was quite famous. It received a lot of media publicity at the time, newspapers, magazines, television shows, little documentary things. It was seen as a standard bearer of the alternative society movement, and one of the objectives of the commune was specifically to do that, to be a sort of a communication center for all things alternative and progressive. People, seminars and things were held out there every weekend, and it also modeled things like organic farming and stuff um, like that, and other things. Um, so for a while it was notorious or famous, depending on your point of view. This is also the heyday of the commune movement. Hundreds of communes were established in Australia in the early 70s, mid 70s. Um, especially in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, where in fact many still exist now into their third generation of residents. Two of the principal founders of the Glenfield Farm Cooperative were a guy called James Freeland Leacock and Charles F. Bowers. And it turned out during this research, I mean, this is a bit of something and nothing research really, but it wasn't something as I was expecting to find. But it turned out during the research, that both of these founders, principal founders, had been inspired by Christian communes or radical Christian communes. Jim Leacock was inspired by a commune in New Zealand, and Charles Bowers was inspired by one in the United States. So I'm going to talk about these guys a little while. So Jim Leacock was born in 1879, and he died in 1974, shortly before I moved in, though I did meet him. He had an extraordinary life, and I'll try not to get too carried away with all the bits and pieces of his life. But he was 5 months old when he arrived in Australia. He was the youngest of 5 children. His father was a doctor. They moved around a bit, but they finished up in the southwest area around Camden. When Jim was 8, his father died, and the family was thrown. His father caught tuberculosis from a patient and died, and the family was thrown into poverty. But he did manage to get a bit of an education, and he was very self-reliant. By the age of 19, after saving up some money, working as an accountant in an accountant's office, and then as a drover, he had enough money to rent a small farm out near Picton. He had a little shop going, and he also had the postal contract. So this is at 19. But then along came the First Anglo-Boer War. The Second Anglo-Boer War. And being a bit of an adventurously inclined young man, he volunteered and went off to South Africa to fight. He joined the New South Wales Regiment of Imperial Bushmen, and off in 1900 went off to South Africa to fight. He did 2 tours of duty. His regiment returned after a year, but he couldn't settle and went back and did another tour in South Africa. At the end of that, the war ended too fast for him. He and a bunch of mates that he'd served with decided they didn't want to come back to Australia, that they wanted to explore Africa. So they rode their horses from Cape Town to Aden over a space of several months. Anybody who knows their geography knows how freaking far that is. They made their way doing odd jobs, about which he was pretty vague, but it seems that mostly with their odd jobs were to hire themselves out as mercenaries, because of course they just had a bit of experience and they could ride and they could shoot. When he got to Aden, he tried to get a job as a policeman and missed out to somebody better connected, and didn't have the money to get his fare home. So he did one last job. He got employed by the Sultan of Oman to rescue a princess who had been kidnapped by bandits and was being held for ransom. And he very rarely told this story, and there's some doubt about whether it's true, though I think it is true. But he and his mates rescued this Omani princess. With the money, he had enough money to come back to Australia, and he set himself up as a travelling salesman, selling acetylene gas and alcohol all over New South Wales. When he got a bit of money together, and then he bought land out at Concord and established a dairy farm, and he produced and sold the first bottled milk in Australia. His business was called Hygienic Dairies, and he produced hygienic milk in bottles, which he had to have specially made because bottles weren't mass produced then. This is 1909. And he had all the contracts with hospitals because the milk he produced was hygienic. It wasn't pasteurized. Pasteurized milk was still to come, but it was hygienic. So he had a business going doing that, and then along came the First World War. Well, he's now 35. He joins the Light Horse and goes off to Gallipoli, fights in Gallipoli on foot, of course, with the rest of the Light Horse. And then he gets sent back to Egypt, where his regiment is reunited with their horses, and then they're engaged in combat against the Turks for control of the Suez Canal. In 1916, he's involved in the Battle of Romani with the Australian Light Horse, and he's shot through the shoulder, and he can no longer hold a rifle, so he's invalided home. So he misses the famous Light Horse charge of Beersheba, but that was his unit. He returned to Australia, and he bought Glenfield Farm in 1920. And is established as a dairy farm, 350 acres on the outskirts of Liverpool. He also had a job as a land valuer and bought and sold land and made a bit of money that way. He was very much of a maverick. He was interested in cooperatives. He was very early supporter of Aboriginal rights and other progressive things. He was interested in organic farming and environmentalism. And he was quite a devout Christian. His worldview shifted by the 1940s. He became involved with something called moral rearmament in the 1940s, which was a multi-faith evangelical movement founded by a Lutheran minister, Frank Buchmann, which advocated moral rearmament instead of military rearmament. It was an American thing, as a solution to the world's problems. This is like 1945, 46, at the beginning of the Cold War. It didn't really suit Jim too much after a while because it was a bit too sort of authoritarian and stuff. In his retirement, he's now in his 60s. In his retirement, he became very active in the Aboriginal rights movement and knew all of the leading Aboriginal activists of the day. He was a campaigner for the vote, the 1966 referendum and stuff like that. He became even more involved in organic farming and environmentalism, and he was described by the media as Australia's oldest demonstrator. And and then later he became known as Australia's oldest hippie. He was interested in cooperatives, and he was interested in communes, and he actually tried to set up a couple of communes. One in 1949. In fact, he's transferred his property to a rural homes cooperative, which failed because most of the people who signed up to join the cooperative weren't very cooperative. and treated their share as freehold to a portion of the land. So they didn't do the cooperating part of it. They just did the farming bit. It went bankrupt. And as a result, he lost most of the property. He was left with 14 acres, down from 350 to 14 acres. The court case went on for years and years. Um, he also tried to set up another commune called Christian Community in 1955. And he continued his activism, and he became a pacifist. He became involved with the Religious Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, in the 1960s, and became very active. In fact, was a leading member of the leading protagonist in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He regularly spoke at town hall meetings, using his own experience as a former fighter for king and country, and contrasting that with the pacifism that he'd embraced. He was threatened with jail for breaking the law, hiding drive resistors and stuff, but the government wasn't dumb enough to actually jail a 90-year-old former Gallipoli veteran. But he was quite prominent in all of that in the late 60s, early 70s. He hadn't given up on the idea of communes. By the way, over the years, he'd filled the farm, every available building, with people who needed a helping hand. A lot of misfits, right back to the 1940s, drunks. He gave them jobs and place to live. So he was very much a philanthropist. But he was also interested in communal living and tried to form a commune out of it. In about 1969, the opportunity arose for him to get serious about it again. He hived off a half-acre either side of the homestead to his two daughters, built them a house each. So then he felt he could do what he wanted with the rest of the property. So he then sold the rest of the property to in exchange for a $40,000 interest-free loan payable in 10 years. So basically, he gave it away to the Glenfell Goodwill Cooperative, which involved a lot of other people of like-minded sort of interests. This was in 1972. He was 92 at the time. Just turned 93 actually at the time when the transfer happened. He had life residency. A lot of people involved in the cooperative were Quakers, but also all sorts of other sort of radical type hippie types, I guess you could say. The objectives of the cooperative were to run this communication centre thing for all things progressive, peace movement, Aboriginal rights, gay rights, everything progressive, organic farming and all that sort of thing, to restore the buildings. He was very interested in the history of the place and wanted to restore the property and preserve it. And also organic farming, which he was pioneering at the farm. Hundreds of people came to stay. In fact, over the space of 1973, more than 2,000 people came to stay on weekends and participated in seminars and things, helped with the farming and stuff like that. And that's when I got involved. But one of the inspirations for this cooperative was something called Riverside Community, which was a commune in New Zealand. This was an inspired gym. It was established in 1941 by Christian pacifists on a 37-acre farm in the lower Mutare Valley in New Zealand. They were mostly Methodists, they'd grown up in the Bible class movement, which became independent from the Methodist Church in 1914. The Bible class movement took an absolute pacifist position in 1935. The Riverside founders were also members of the Christian Pacifist Society, which expressed social justice concerns within Methodism. Some Quakers and Anglicans also joined the community. Most of the men from this community were sent to prison farms during World War II because of their pacifist position. But the community survived, and immediately after the Second World War, when they were released, it expanded rapidly. It ended up acquiring 500 acres, and its membership increased significantly. All of its members made a living, agricultural living on the property, mainly from commercial orcharding. An influx of younger people came in with a range of different beliefs, joined the community in the 70s. And by the late 70s, it was no longer a Christian commune, though it had been for several decades. And a more liberal atmosphere prevailed. But in other respects, the community remained the same. The Riverside community still exists in New Zealand today, so it's still an ongoing commune which supports its membership. Jim Leacock was aware of Riverside. I'm not sure when, but certainly by the mid-50s, perhaps even earlier. And he was likely in contact with it. Riverside community circulated newsletters widely. In 1954, he considered establishing a Christian commune on his property at Glenfield. And he did this in collaboration with an Anglican minister, Reverend Leo Ball. Leo Ball was also a member of the Communist Party of Australia, as well as being an Anglican minister, and was a bit of a eccentric, to say the least. Ball went on to found one of Australia's first urban communes in Prahran, sorry, let's get the pronunciation right, the way the Borneans pronounce it, in Prahran, in Melbourne. As I said, he was an eccentric. He was described as a manic Gandhi in Bombay bloomers, manic Gandhi and Bombay bloomers. Ball also went to Riverside. He was a member of the Riverside community for a few years, but he was regarded as a bit of an acerbic character. Leacock himself visited Riverside in 1968, and he always held it up as an example of what could be achieved. The second founder of the Glenfield Goodwill Cooperative is a guy called Charlie Bowers. Charlie was born in 1938. He died only recently in 2019. Ironically, his father was a detective in the Vice Squad. Charlie was educated at St. Aloysius, which is a highly privileged Catholic college in Kirribilli. His family members were old boys, so he was able to get in at a half rate. He went to Naval College at 15, university at 18. He left the Navy at 20 to study for the priesthood, and he was ordained as a Catholic minister in 1965. Charlie became very active in Catholics for Peace, anti-Vietnam War movement. In fact, he was one of the founders of Catholics for Peace. Catholics for Peace and Charlie in particular clashed frequently with the church authorities, who were very enthusiastic, extremely enthusiastic, the Catholic hierarchy in Australia, for prosecution of the war. The links between the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Sydney and the Catholics in Vietnam. So he got into trouble and was threatened with being suspended from the priesthood. He went off to England in 1968 to work with a progressive English bishop, a guy called Derek Warlock. I think Warlock's a very great name for a Catholic priest. So he was in England for several months, working in progressive Catholics there. Then he went to the United States, initially for a holiday, but he became involved with radical Catholics in the United States, specifically with a group called the Catholic Worker Movement. He returned to Sydney in 1970, and he resumed his involvement in the anti-war movement, and he also left the priesthood. He was one of the founding members of CAMP, Campaign Against Moral Persecution. He claims that he was the person who gave it the name, though a number of the other founders also claimed that they were the people who came up with the name. CAMP was one of the first gay rights activist groups in Sydney. Charlie moved into Glenfield Farm, and he helped found Glenfield Goodwill Cooperative. And he lived at Glenfield Farm as an openly gay man until 1974. And back in the early 70s, there were very few places where you could live openly as a gay man. So that says something about the community, and also something I think about Jim Leacock, who was 93, 94 at the time, who was perfectly okay with this. I should also mention that Jim Leacock was also an advocate of the women's movement. Later, Charlie worked in the New South Wales Deputy Premier's office, and he was one of the architects of the homosexual law reforms that were enacted in 1984, which were driven by the then Deputy Premier of New South Wales. Later still, he worked for the UN's Transitional Authority in Cambodia and in East Timor during referendums. So, he had a life of sort of service and stuff like and progressive causes. I want to talk a little bit about the Catholic Worker Movement. It's been described as a Christian anarchist movement. It was founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Moran in 1933. It operates a collection of autonomous communities, some rural, some urban, and publishes a newspaper called The Catholic Worker. The aim of the Catholic Worker Movement was to, quote, live in accordance with the justice and charity of Jesus Christ. That is, in their interpretation, to live in radical solidarity with the poor. The farming communes that they operated on the principle of everyone working according to their ability and receiving according to their needs, which of course is also phraseology found in the Communist Manifesto. The movement was sort of a nexus between radical social justice politics in the church and outside the church, and also the ideas of self-sufficiency and the ideas of organic farming. And so also overlapping significantly with a lot of the hippie ideas, I guess you could say, of the late 60s. Charlie moved into one of the movement's resistance communes, as they were known, in an old Victorian building in St. Louis, Missouri. The principal objective of this particular commune was to run a grade school for African-American children. And Charlie lived and taught there for several months. This commune was also heavily involved in the draft resistance movement. Most of the teachers at the commune were draft resistors, and the commune was frequently raided. Well, Charlie was there. He became friends with a radical Catholic priest, a guy called Daniel Berrigan, or Berrigan. Berrigan was a Jesuit who became one of the most prominent anti-war activists during the Vietnam War. He was famous as a member of what was known as the Catonsville Nine, which is 9 Catholic activists who burned 378 draft files with napalm as a stunt. Berrigan featured on the FBI's most wanted list. I think probably the only Catholic priest to feature on the FBI's most wanted list. And he also featured on the cover of Time magazine. And Charlie and him spent a lot of time together. And these experiences in America solidified Charlie's radical politics. And he was also strongly influenced by the organic farming commune ideas of the Catholic worker movement while he was in the United States. So when Charlie returned to Australia in 1970, his ideas very much gelled with those of Jim Leacock. And in fact, you could, I like to think of it as the times catching up with Jim Leacock rather than him shifting. All the things he was interested in, he'd been interested in since the 1940s. Only now he had an audience of people who were 2 generations younger than him. And now he had the youthful activism of a man in his late 30s, who could help him establish the cooperative. The two saw eye to eye. They knew each other from the anti-Vietnam movement. They were speakers together on the town hall steps and things like that. So anyway, so Charlie moved into the commune and helped with establishing it. So conclusions. Well, I don't really have any. As I said, this was just a little bit of a side element of this research. When I lived at the farm, the religious dimension was not something I was aware of. It was not a religious community. So I knew that Jim Leacock was a Quaker, and I knew that Charlie used to be a Catholic priest, but in no other respect did I have any sense of there being any sort of Christian background to the commune that I was a part of. There were some vague New Age Eastern ideas wafting around with the incense and the marijuana. That was the religious dimension or spiritual dimension that I was more familiar with rather than the Christian element. But I was struck while doing this research with this part of this aspect of the story, which Rowan and I dug up together. Perhaps it suggests that radical Christian ideas were some small part of the multi-stranded, tie-dyed thread of the counterculture. That's the only conclusion that I can offer.